Good day, everybody. Hey, it's Chris Gallagher. It is a Wednesday, and we're coming to you, and we're excited about our study in Romans chapter 6 this week, and I hope that you are excited about this as well. This is one of those passages that the more you dig into, the more that you will see that there are so many things that are in there. But if you're looking for other studies, go ahead and check us out at preacherspen.org. That's where you can find us, preacherspen.org. And as you search around there, you're going to see some other Bible classes. You'll see some articles. You'll even see our podcast, and you're able to go and you're able to listen to that to find out what kind of greatness is happening and how we can assist you in making better spiritual decisions today for a greater spiritual life tomorrow. And that is what we are after each and every day. So let's do this. Let's just jump into our text today, see what we can get through, but also at the same time, give you some background information because this is utterly significant, I believe, to this study. So once again, check us out, preacherspen.org. If you need to find out some more information, you can find it out there. Also, while you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter and also our prayer page. You can fill that out if you have a prayer request, and we'll gladly pray for you. But where we've left off in our study is we've left off getting into verse 12 of Romans chapter 6. But I find it necessary to give you some background information about the church at Rome, because typically when we think about Paul writing to a church, many people think of rebukes and reproofs. They've got a problem. Paul is writing to correct that. And many times that's absolutely true. After all, what church doesn't have a problem? Or what local congregation is not suffering some sort of abnormality or they're going through a struggle at this time? We all have those because we're human. And being human, we know that we have the capability to do great things and we have the capability to do some pretty rough things. But we want to make sure that in all that we do, we are doing what's right to the best of our abilities. To be able to do that, we get into the Word. We see what the Word has to say. And in the book of Romans, in chapter 1, we read a few of these, but I want you to notice something that Paul says. In Romans chapter 1, I find this, once again, interesting as I consider exactly what Paul is telling the early church. And he says in Romans chapter 1, verse 8, is where we're going to pick up. He says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed throughout the entire world." Now, when you think about the known world at this time, you know that Rome is the occupying force in Jerusalem and Judea and what we would call the Holy Lands. Excuse me, a little bit of allergies. Dealing with those, we're going to get those out later. But we know that Rome is the occupying world. So as a result, we know that there's a church in Rome. That's why Paul is writing this letter to the church or to the saints that are in Rome. He's writing this to give them motivation and encouragement. But notice what he says. Their faith is so strong that it says that their faith is proclaimed throughout the entire world. So he thanks God for them, and he says, this is what your faith is doing. This is where your faith is. For us as Christians in 2023, we must understand that our faith is important. We must understand that our faith is extremely important because we have influence. Even in social media, things that we watch on YouTube or Rumble, or we have an influence to the people around us. So our faith, too, can be proclaimed throughout the entire world. That's why it's important for us to strengthen our faith, to make sure that our faith is not only our faith, but our faith is being used in such a way that it's becoming an influence for Christ. Remember that James writes, James chapter 2, verses 14 through verse 26, that faith without works is dead. So we have to have the actions that accompany our faith. Faith is believing in something that we know there's evidence of, but we cannot see if you look at a passage such as Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. If you get into Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, it says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. So without faith, it's impossible to please God. For when we come to God, we must believe that he is, and we must believe that he's a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. So there's belief and actions right there in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. That's what we're talking about. When we talk about faith, it has actions behind it. So Paul is writing to a church whose faith was proclaimed throughout the entire world. That allows him, as he shares with them, don't go on sinning. That's the first 11 verses. Don't go on sinning and just blame it on grace or just take advantage of grace. But instead, what you need to do is you need to stay faithful. You need to stay on this track. In fact, look at verse 12. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal bodies to make you obey its passions. He said, you've got to get sin out. You have to take sin out of your life, out of your body, out of your mind. Because look what he says in the next verse, one of my favorite. He says, do not present your members as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as being those who brought from life to death, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. An instrument of righteousness is something that's used for righteousness. So he's telling them, don't let sin reign in your bodies, in this body. Don't let sin reign in this body, but instead use your body as an instrument, a tool. If you trace that word instrument back, this is what becomes, to me, utterly fascinating. And that is, that word can mean weapons. So do not use your bodies as weapons of unrighteousness. And he tells them a little bit about this. But present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life. Interesting connection. We go back to the beginning of Romans chapter 6. What I mean by that is this. When you take a look at him saying, don't present your bodies as weapons as of righteousness, but present yourself to God, having been from death to life. Now, what does that mean? Go back up in the text and look at verse 4. We were buried with him through baptism into death. So baptism brings us into death, like the burial of Jesus, in order that just as Jesus Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. So baptism, is our death to sin and our being alive to God. That's why that is so important. And I shared a little bit yesterday of the idea of baptism. But look again today. Look at the power of what's being discussed. Look at the power of what's being discussed today as you look at what this means. If you're going to be an instrument or a tool or a weapon of righteousness, then you first have to present your body to God as going from death to life. That's what you have to do. If you have not presented your body as going from death to life, then it seems to me in this text that you are still a weapon, a tool, an instrument for unrighteousness. So you have to make that change. You have to make that change in the direction of God. And when you do that, once again, read the text. When you do that, it has to do with baptism, but it also has to do with your actions after baptism. Because now you've become a weapon for righteousness to God. I believe, side note, I believe that's why Paul says to clothe yourselves in the full armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. In fact, we'll make that our study for next week. Ephesians chapter 6, put on the full armor of God that you can stand against the wiles of the devil, as that verse begins in chapter 6, verse 10 of the book of Ephesians. So Paul is saying you got to present yourself to God as being a new life, and you're going to become what he says here in verse 13, as an instrument for righteousness. And here's why. Verse 14, for sin will no longer have dominion over you, for you're not under the law, but you're under grace. He says that sin will no longer have dominion over you because you are not under the law, the Old Testament law, but you are under grace. Now you ask yourself, okay, what does this mean? Go back to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, I would just key in on this verse. Please go back and read it in context, and you'll see this. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, or I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God of salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, for it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So when you take an example and you start to look into this just a little bit more, you start to dig into something. And what you dig into is this: the gospel is for everybody. The good news of the gospel, it's not just for the Jews, it's not just for the Greeks, it's not just for the Gentiles, it's not just for the apostles, it's not just for Paul, it's for everybody. And as a result of that, all of us are now where we need to be if we are under the grace of God. It's not the law, it's grace. So therefore, we are into righteousness. And righteousness is what we need to exude every day of our life. something to think about today. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of our study. We hope that you have a blessed day, and we look forward to talking to you soon. Be blessed.